Once more, hello, and welcome to the Working Class Movement Library series of Invisible Histories talks. Particularly, we welcome our speaker who's joining us from Ireland, Terry Dunne, who will speak to us on Land and Labour, the Agrarian Question in the Irish Revolution, 1913 to 23. The library's events are, as usual, free. However, as we always say, we would like you to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so, and there's a donate button on our website. Thanks very much. Over to you, Terry.
First off, thanks to the Working Class Movement Library for hosting me, and thanks to you all for being here to listen. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is three distinct movements that took place within the Irish Revolution from 1913 to 1923. And I'll give you a bit of a background, and then I'll talk about how the labour movement, a debate within the labour movement as to what the agrarian policy of the movement should be. Now, first of all, for as regards a bit of the historiographical introduction, the dominant view of the Irish Revolution is as a sort of a militaristic event, which is typified by the illustration you see there from a 1966 commemorative pamphlet. But I'd argue that this dominant view doesn't reflect the diverse forms of mobilisation that took place and the limited and regionalised nature of the armed conflict which took place. So what you're going to hear today is a kind of an untypical, still unfortunately an untypical view of the Irish Revolution. Now, as I said, I'm going to be talking about three different movements. There are the cattle drives which took place in 1920, in the spring and summer of 1920. The farm workers movement, which particularly took the form of a massive expansion of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in the years between 1917 and 1923. And then I'm also going to be talking about the Irish Farmers Union. Right. So we have to get a kind of a geographical picture, because agriculture is obviously closely tied to ecology, and it takes place in very distinct regions. So what you see on the PowerPoint there at the moment, shaded along the west, is the areas that the British state singled out for particular intervention from 1891 onwards, but especially from 1909 onwards. And that's your classic small farmer zone, right? But even outside of that area, the majority of farms were considered uneconomic by the state. So when I'm talking about the cattle drives, that was particularly found in these kind of small farm zone area along the western seaboard, yeah. Then when you're talking about the farm labourers movement, it happens in a more another area again. We're pretty much talking about the area to the south and east of that line you see running across the map there, right? Now, these are areas of distinct physical geographies. So even today, the three counties that you see there, Mayo, Roscommon, Galway, which is where the cattle drives which is the core area of the cattle drives. Even today, there are areas which they're basically the areas of poorest farmland, were most environmentally disadvantaged. By contrast with the southeast, and that's figures from the 1990s there show that the value of farm output in the southeast was 3 times that of what is in the three counties in the west, where the cattle drives were most prominent. But I don't want to come across here as a person that's arguing that like physical geography determines everything. These were social distinctions as well as distinctions of physical geography. So the you can kind of paint with a broad brush and say the areas that are more environmentally challenged are the areas where you tend to find smaller farms, and the areas which are more environmentally advantaged are the areas where you tend to find bigger farms. But this, I mean, there are social distinctions as well. So if you actually look as to where the larger or highest value farms were located, it's actually more North Leinster that you see there indicated in yellow rather than necessarily the southeast, okay? But bearing that in mind, the important takeaway here is we're talking about quite distinct regions, even with some overlaps, yeah? So we'll start off with the cattle drives. The cattle drives were mobilisations for the redistribution of farmland, particularly concentrated in East Connacht. That's the three counties I showed you there, Roscommon, Galway and Mayo, in the spring and early summer of 1920. But there was a precursor in 1918, and there was also a later wave of similar agrarian conflict in 22 and going into 23. But spring, early summer of 1920 were the really big years. Now, Kevin O'Sheil, whose job in the Dáil courts, which were the alternative Republican legal system, alternative to the Crown, his job was basically to curtail this movement. But he's also the man who gave us the best description of it. So he wrote about how in the spring and summer of 1920, I'm gonna quote him now. Dublin was full of landed refugees who gave alarming accounts of their treatment at the hands of land-hungry people. All had their stock cleared, cattle and sheep driven off their fields and for miles along the hard roads of Connacht until some died of exhaustion. Walls and gates were destroyed and trees felled, and you can see a destroyed wall there in the picture, and occasionally barns and outbuildings were levelled by fire. Anonymous letters, signed sometimes IRA, sometimes Sinn Féin, and sometimes with greater truth, Captain Moonlight, commanded the recipient to clear certain fields of his stock, to surrender certain acres to a local land committee, and frequently to clear out himself. Posters forbidding any person to bid at the annual auctioning of certain 11-month lettings were posted up on the piers of the gates of lands concerned. In places where the landlord or landholder proved obstinate, there was a mute, significant, and generally effective gesture in the shape of a grave neatly opened on his lawn or at his front door. So that's how Kevin O'Sheil explained what was going on in the spring and summer of 1920. Now, the important context for this is an inequality in the distribution of farmland. So the majority of farms were small, while the larger part of the area of farmland was found on larger farms. Yeah. 1/3 of the country's agricultural land, including almost 2/3 of its arable land, was on farms of over 100 acres. So a few statistics there. I won't go through all of them, but for an example, Roscommon, which is one of the counties at the heart of this movement, had 18,700 holdings of over 1 acre. Over 1 acre just means it was, more in the lines of a farm. Anything under an acre is a garden, really. Of those 18,700, 15,000 of them were under 30 acres, with 8,500 under 15 acres. So you're talking about a concentration of quite small farms in the western heartland of the country. But as I said, even outside of the West, a large majority of farms were designated uneconomic by the Department of Agriculture, so there was the potential for this movement to spread. Then you had the what was called the 11-month system, or so-called untenanted land. This was land usually held by wealthy graziers on a temporary basis, so they'd buy up young cattle, keep them on those lands over a period to the agency of a herd or a herdsman, sell them on. So there was a bustling land market for this so-called untenanted land, and it's actually often that is the land which is targeted by this movement. And an important context is the pronounced lack of industrial development in this region, combined with the minimal employment opportunities afforded by cattle raising. So access to land was important to people because this was the only source of livelihood in their area, and the alternative was migration. And in fact, even landholders migrated from there on a seasonal basis, especially to Scotland. But on the other hand, this was against a backdrop of state intervention. Yeah. So the Congested Districts Board had already been set up under the auspices of the British state and had already embarked on a program of land redistribution and infrastructural development. So it wasn't just a matter of perceived inequality. There was also the perception that something would be done about it. So that the movement in 1920 was part of a series of episodes of mass collective action going back in recent decades, which had already had real impacts. And the other significant thing about the cattle drives of 1920 is they gave a major impetus to the development of the Republican counter-state, in that Republicans set up a separate legal system, separate from that of the Crown, basically to adjudicate in situations of disputed land, which is where Kevin O'Shiel, who I was quoting earlier, came into it. Now, so if that was what was going on in the western part of the country, though, as I say, it did have ripples elsewhere. In that area that I showed you that was more to the south and east, broadly speaking, is where you found the farm workers movement, where you found waged employment in agriculture. Now, the single biggest employment sector for male workers in the Irish Free State in the 1920s was farm labour. Wage employment on farms is also by far the largest occupational group in the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in the revolutionary years, was farm workers. It's difficult to get quite exact figures, but you're talking about maybe 50,000 farm workers out of 100,000 members. And the next biggest occupational group was dockers, which come in at about 4,000 or 5,000. Yeah. So it's, for those years, you could, half of the transport union were farm workers. Now, the course of the farm worker movement kind of essentially relates to the First World War, to subsistence, fears of subsistence crisis in the context of the First World War, food price inflation, fear of possible labour shortages, with people perhaps moving to work in munitions. So the government response to the food situation was in 1917 to impose a measure of compulsory tillage on farmers. Compulsory tillage was introduced from January 1917 across the United Kingdom, and there was also agricultural wages boards established to set up legal minimum wages and conditions for this fear of labour shortages. So pretty much starting from there, from March 1917, there's the beginnings of a kind of militant and radicalised farm worker movement. Now, it starts off with small local unions, local initiatives, sometimes a revival of the old land and labour associations, which were linked to the Irish Parliamentary Party, the old Home Rule Party. The Transport Union came in later and absorbed those local groups. It's part of a process of expansion where the union, hitherto confined to Dublin and some port towns, went from a process of having about 5,000 members to about 100,000 in the space of a couple of years. So this is really a story of sudden, swift growth, and then also quick, not quite as quick, retraction and collapse. So the movement has to be understood in terms of this demand for labour that came out of compulsory tillage, and the greater employments opened up by compulsory tillage, which very briefly reversed the long-term pattern in Irish agriculture away from labour-intensive cereals to much less labour-intensive cattle production. So as we get into the 1920s, the situation changed. Compulsory tillage ends. You have the slump. And the situation in the mid-1920s was described by a veteran of the movement, Bill O'Brien from Clonmel in South Tipperary, in a very rare and important reminiscence committed to print in the early 1950s. He wrote, and this is about the 1920s now, so this is after the heyday of the movement. When a man was sacked from a job in these days, he was not given another. Employers were loyal to one another, and besides, labourers were plenty. It was nothing strange to find half a dozen unemployed after one job, half a dozen unemployed men after one job, each undercutting the other. The workers' table saw more dinner times than dinners in those days. So it's in that context that a kind of a fleeting radicalism dissipates. But okay, just to go back a minute now, what you have in your PowerPoint is the movement started in March 1917. As I say, it was mostly small unions set up or collective wage demands made. There actually wasn't that much violence or sabotage. There's one incident of sabotage I thought was quite interesting, which was a destruction of a motor plow, which is what you see depicted there. Sorry, I'm getting, yeah. But there was a real radicalism. Sorry, from current slide. Sorry, I rearranged my PowerPoint at the last minute. I wanted to show you this now. As I say, there was a real radicalism. It wasn't just a wages movement. People did have a conception that they were creating a new world, which you can see here in this nice little cartoon from the pages of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union's newspaper, The Voice of Labour. It's commenting on the Irish Civil War of 1922 to 23. And as you can see there, there's a family who has the choice of going down a road to the capitalist free state, where there's wage slavery, the capitalist republic where there's wage slavery, or the workers' republic where there's economic freedom. But this radicalism dissipated because of what Bill O'Brien was talking about there a minute ago. But I would argue that we can't just talk about the movement in terms of objective factors, because there was an earlier history of less militant, less radical farm worker organisation. And if we just talk about the objective factors, we're also a leading agency. So what I have pictured there on the PowerPoint is something of the earlier mobilisation of the land and labour associations before 1917, which won extensive rural public housing. Some of them, the typical types of rural labourers' council cottages depicted there. There's actually 50,000 council cottages built in Ireland for rural workers in the decades running up to 1914, mostly in the decade just before 1914. Now, hopefully people here will have time for questions and answers and comments, and people will be able to correct me. But I actually think that's the first public housing program within the United Kingdom to that extent. But we'll be able to discuss it. So, farm workers were mobilising before 1917, and before there was this special circumstances that they were able to take advantage of. Now, then you had the Irish Farmers Union. The Irish Farmers Union was an interesting organisation. Mostly, it's what represented farmers in their negotiations and conflict with the transport union. It's an interesting organisation in that it managed to combine people. Now, Andrew Kettle there wasn't actually still alive for the Irish Farmers Union, but he was alive. He was the leader of one of its precursor organisations. He had long been a farmer's leader in their struggle against landlords in the 19th century, going back to the 1850s. Yeah, he was involved in the Tenants' Rights League in the 1850s. He was still there to fight Larkinism, or the bully Larkin, as he called it, in 1913. But as well as people like that, the Irish Farmers Union also involved at leadership level quite a number of ex-landlords. People tend to think of landlords as just people, well, I suppose the definition of landlord is someone letting land or letting a property, but lots of them also owned large farms in their own rights. So you see the other picture there, you see the Crowbar Brigade at work at evicting people off the O'Callaghan estates during the infamous Bodyke evictions in the 1880s. But the funny thing is the son of the man who was responsible for those evictions went on to become a farmer's leader quite successfully and well regarded, it seems. So the Irish Farmers Union represented farmers in their conflict with their employees. Also opposed government regulation, particularly compulsory tillage. It was also very much against global free trade. In this instance, opposing any lifting of the ban on the import of live cattle from Canada. Sometimes raised issue of what prices farmers were getting for their produce and price-setting cartels among merchants. Also, interestingly, supported unpurchased tenants. So at this stage, still about a third of Irish farmers were tenants. They'd yet to buy out their properties under the Land Acts, and the Irish Farmers Union, despite having the involvement of ex-landlords at leadership level, was supporting unpurchased tenants. But the major clash between the Irish Farmers Union and the labour movement was actually the butter and bacon embargo of April 1920, when dock workers attempted to keep food prices down by refusing to export food. Now, the context here was there was inflation fears because the First World War controls of food prices were still in effect for the years after the First World War, but they were just being lifted in the spring of 1920, and the workers' movement wanted them to continue. Now, here we're getting to the whole issue of agrarian policy and how you relate to a situation where the working class is the minority. The working class is a minority even of the agrarian workforce. So this kind of starts off with this butter and bacon embargo. And the open letter issued by the Trade Union Congress Executive when some of the Cork and Limerick bacon curing firms said that they would shut down their factories rather than accede to price control is of interest. And it's of interest because it shows something of how they're trying to appeal to farmers, okay? And what they do is they posit the category of working farmer, okay? And they attempt to appeal to working farmers by offering a scheme of cooperative marketing, which would offer a better price for producers by cutting out mercantile middlemen. And this is something where we're going to see the trade union leadership pushing on other occasions in the next few years in the 1920s. So it has that on the one hand, and on the other hand, interestingly, for a British audience, it has the stick, yeah? And so the carrot is with cooperative marketing, and you'll get a better price for your produce. And the stick is the miners, railwaymen, and dock workers of industrial Britain, yeah? Because it says that we will take over, that if you oppose us, we will take over your bacon curing firms. We will run the factories under workers' control. And okay, yeah, the Crown government may mobilise against us, but I wonder how that's going to sit with the Triple Alliance in Britain, right? So when we're talking about the Irish Revolution, or we're talking about the workers' movement of the Irish Revolution, we immediately have to bring in two other contexts. One is the agrarian context and how it relates to farmers in Ireland, and the other is the context of how it relates to the working class movement in Britain. Today, we're just talking about the agrarian context. How am I doing? How am I doing for time there?
You've had about 20, 25 minutes.
Okay. I'm just coming into our final part now.
Okay, good stuff.
About agrarian policy, right? So it's this agrarian context where can you appeal to working farmers? Can you... Is there some way that the labour movement can relate to them, working farmers? Yeah, in a context where the working class is the minority, right? So, what was the intellectual heritage that they had to deal with this issue? So, James Connolly wrote a couple of short articles on agrarian matters, peasant proprietorship and socialism, and the Irish land question in 1898. And capitalism and the Irish small farmers in 1909, all in response to agrarian movements, and all of which predicted, quote, the doom of the petty farmers of Ireland under the capitalist system. And it's kind of funny that Connolly is credited with Hibernicizing Marxism, because his position here is entirely within the orbit of Second International Orthodoxy. But of course, he has to be seen in context of the time and neither deified nor pillared by hindsight. So there's the premise there that the small farmer class is just going to disappear under the face of transatlantic imports, under the face of efficiencies of scale, new machinery, and the centralization of capital, basically. Of course, we know now that those things actually happen quite like that. So things come to a head in 1923. In 22-23, there are three bitter defeats inflicted on the farm workers' movement. First of all, in South Kildare, in Waterford, and in the Ballingarry district along the Kilkenny-Tipperary border. Now, even after the slump, they're still maintaining higher the wage rates that they won in the earlier period. Now, you could argue the wage rates are just keeping in line with inflation. But at this time, Irish farm workers are being paid better than farm workers in Norfolk, which was the exact opposite of the situation hitherto existing forever, basically, hitherto existing always in previous decades. But for our purposes today, what's more interesting than those three defeats are the situation in County Dublin, where in response to wage reduction demands from the local Farmers Association, the union leadership, the transport union leadership, start to push again this idea of cooperative marketing. And now eventually some reductions are agreed with the proviso of a joint compact to investigate the possibilities of cooperative marketing and the establishment of an agricultural industrial council, bringing together representative bodies under the auspices of the state, under the auspices of the Department of Agriculture. But in fact, most of this peters out fairly quickly. One gets the impression the membership were not at all, the rank and file rural farm workers were not at all interested in this. In fact, it was being sold as a means of reducing food costs to town workers. So I'm not really sure what the appeal to rural labour was. Now, at the same time, there was a survey of rural branches of the Transport Union as to what agrarian policy they felt should be appropriate. And there was also an essay competition in the pages of the Voice of Labour, the Transport Union's newspaper, as to what the agrarian policy should be. So it was like you wrote in, and the best essays were, individual members wrote in, and the best essays were picked out and published. So 100 branches replied to the survey. There was fairly general agreement on certain matters, and those, that's to quote the Congress report, those certain matters were the extension of labourers' plots, and B, unemployment insurance. But this was kind of dismissed with the argument that we should be looking at, quote, what is practicable as well as desirable, right? Now, the context of the proposed demand to extend labourers' plots was the fact the aforementioned public housing came with half an acre or 1 acre kitchen gardens, which were also used to carry on petty trade in poultry and pigs. I'll get back to that now in a minute. What's seen in the essay competition is quite different and concerned with cooperative farming, and whether or not we need to concern ourselves with that before or after the conquest of political power. And in fact, I don't think the views of the generality of farm labourers really come into the pages of the newspaper much in regard to this question. There's only an occasional letter to the editor or an occasional branch resolution reported on. But I think from what we can see, it's quite at odds with a concern with either cooperative marketing or cooperative farming. Cooperative marketing, certainly. So Congress in 1923 also debated whether or not to support land division or land redistribution. That's the breaking up of large holdings and their reapportion to small farmers, which is what that cattle drive movement that I was speaking about earlier was all about. And this is something which is about to be legislated for. But what Congress does in that is it comes out in favour of common ownership. So in short, this all seems very far removed from the immediate needs and concerns of farm workers. And farm workers were interested in expanding their plots, expanding their garden plots, because they were poorly paid and they had seasonal and precarious employment. So pluriactivity was a central part of their livelihood. That's to say, they conducted their own kitchen garden production, for their own table, and they also conducted their own petty trade. So there's a nice memoir from South Kildare that talks about this. The memoir is actually talking about the 1930s, but I think it goes for the 1920s as well, right? And so this man writes, "We had our own plot of about half an acre in the large fenced garden behind the house, and we sowed vegetables and potatoes every year to sustain the family." Now he goes on to write about how that vegetable plot also reared pigs. Reared a pig, which was, quote, "a significant profit and crucial means of added revenue for the household, especially when you did it 2 or 3 times a year." And then at Christmas time, he goes on to write, "My mother also reared turkeys to supplement our income at Christmas time. The money was used to purchase clothing and footwear for a rapidly increasing family," end quote. Now, to conclude, I'm not sure here how an extension of labourers' plots was impractical, given that the provision of them, along with the provision of council houses, was actually the great social reform of the period, which actually benefited the rural working class. Most social reforms of the period didn't. And I'm inclined to think that a fairly abstract discussion about common ownership, cooperative farms, the centralisation of the capital, got in the way of what practical reforms could have been won at the time. And I think that the interests and needs and concerns of farm workers were kind of absent in that discussion. That's my impression at this stage of research. Now, before I conclude, and I hope we have time for questions and comments, I'll just get in a few plugs. If anyone is interested in hearing more about any of these agrarian movements at the time of the Irish Revolution, I have a podcast, petersandshep.ie, so you can listen to those podcasts wherever you get your podcasts, or you just go straight to petersandshep.ie. And I'm also involved at the moment editing a volume called The Spirit of Revolution, along with John Cunningham of the National University of Ireland, Galway. And that edited volume will be out in 2022. And it's basically collects local case studies of popular mobilisation during the Irish Revolution, both in terms of the labour movement, in terms of agrarian protest, in terms of allotment holders, in terms of women, in terms of dockers smuggling arms for the IRA, all kinds of forms of popular agency and mass mobilisation which have been left out of the historiography of the Irish Revolution due to a focus on high politics and militarism. So I'll shut up now. Thanks for inviting me to speak, and I hope we have time for questions and comments.
Thank you, Terry. Yes, we have indeed. So let's get back the faces. And you see some virtual applause there. So thank you very much, folks, for that on Terry's behalf. And yeah, now we have somebody. I don't know if your sort of challenge about municipal housing or council housing is an interesting one. And Andrew Bibby has commented that the cottage at the top left of the pictures that you have there looks remarkably like Fergus O'Connor's designs for the Chartist land colonies in the 1840s, which is interesting. Okay. Andrew, I know you've got a question there. Do you want to unmute yourself, Andrew, and sort of, yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Well, it just struck me that particularly that cottage in the top left of your slide, Terry, looked remarkably like the cottages in the Chartist colonies in England that Fergus O'Connor was very involved in the 1840s. The sort of the single-story, two-roomed cottages, but that was really by the by. Yeah, I just really was interested in what you were saying about the cooperative movement, and I also wonder whether how you would assess the role of Horace Plunkett, who was involved in the cooperative movement in Ireland and is obviously still remembered in the Plunkett Foundation in this country, working in terms of cooperative regeneration of village shops and village pubs and so on. I think he was a landowner in the south. I think he was a Protestant. I'm not entirely sure, but any thoughts on that one, Terry?
I'm still demuted there, yeah. Okay. Thanks for the comment and the question. To deal with the house one first. Apparently I'm not 100% sure about this, but the council houses sometimes were based upon the better examples of local vernacular traditions of housing. So it's possible that what you've identified could have had the same origins. Like O'Connor could have based his idea of an ideal cottage from the Chartist land plan on the same thing as what a later architect was basing a cottage circa 1880, 1890 or 1900 on. Okay, the question about Plunkett. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer it, because Plunkett, the cooperative movement that was established among Irish farmers from the kind of Plunkett period tended to be in dairying, okay? And the dairying areas that were cooperatives were very successful in was the southwest, whereas the area that I was talking about there was Dublin, and it would have been a cooperative it would have been more a market garden area, and it would have been a cooperative in the retailing of vegetables, yeah. But the other cooperative, there was to be a cooperative in the retailing of vegetables, but also a cooperative in the purchasing of consumer goods, yeah. And there was an Irish wholesale cooperation company that was involved in this. I think the problem with it was that as something to sell farm workers, reduce costs for vegetables isn't something that you're going to sell to farm workers. When I mean, they already had half-acre or acre plots that they were growing their own vegetables on. You know, that wasn't their cost of living. So, and also that's another thing that I see in the some of the literature about this. It's often talking about the interests of town workers and the relationship between town workers and farmers, whereas leaving the actual the workers in the in agriculture to one side. The thing I would say about Plunkett's, the cooperatives that Plunkett was involved in, the dairying cooperatives, I mean, and this was actually Kautsky's argument against cooperatives. They're just maintaining the existing inequality in the rural areas. Yeah. So I mean, the dairying cooperatives were processing the products of farmers who were employers. Yeah. So what are they doing for the rural working class? I'm not sure, but I have not investigated closely a dairying area, so I'm not necessarily taking my word on it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Wave at me, anybody else who has a question. I was interested in the essay competition. That sounded great, the members' essay competition. That sounds like a sort of PhD topic in itself. Is there any more you can tell us about that? Have you looked into that in any detail?
I would be really interested in finding out more about it. Yeah. And who were the people who contributed to it? I haven't like, they're definitely rank and file members. The one guy I was looking up, he wasn't like, he's not a branch secretary or anything. And they are like, and we're talking about intellectually accomplished pieces of work. Yeah. And from rural areas. Okay, I would find it hard to believe that I don't think you see the voices of farm workers reflecting it, but it's definitely something that I'd like to investigate further to find out exactly who the people contributing were.
Yeah. Anybody who wants to pick up on some research, that sounds like a fertile area, no pun intended, with an agrarian context. I like the sound of Captain Moonlight as well. I suspect he wasn't supposed to be a figure in with a cape and flying along, but he sounds good. Yeah, tell us more about Captain Moonlight.
Oh, well, yeah, that's actually an appropriate question, because my research was actually principally on the 19th century, and this is more of a side project for me. And in the 19th century agrarian social conflict, yeah, fictitious leaders that you would be familiar with from the figure of Ned Ludd or Captain Swing feature prominently. Yeah, I'd actually argue that they're a form of collective identity, that people are identifying with movements elsewhere through using these kind of ideas of a fictive figurehead. But by the time you come to 1920, like, it's just, I mean, you've got a tradition of 150 years of using these fearsome pseudonyms to attach to your threatening letters, and there's just it's a recognised part of the repertoire, shall we say?
Right. Yeah. No, it's a good one. I can say yes. It's sort of burnished but threatening. It's a good one. I like that. I might use that for pseudonyms in future. Oh, I've given it away now. Right. Has anybody else got anything that they would like to add, or a question that they would like to ask? Don't be shy. Well, we know that this is being recorded and that people may be picking up on this later. So if that's the case, then we will make sure that your blog details are on our YouTube channel as well, so that people can come back to you and ask any questions that way, or find out more from your blog. So Shall we draw to a close? You got anything else you want to say, Terry? If you
No, I'd just like to thank the Working Class Movement Library again for hosting the talk.
Right, brilliant. Okay, thank you so much for coming. That's that short distance, but yet that long distance. So we appreciate that, particularly on a lovely sunny day where you are, and we hope we get that too soon. So next week, folks, on Wednesday, the 2nd of June, 2 p.m, we're very pleased to be welcoming Steve Illingworth, who's much nearer at hand in Salford, who will be speaking on the topic, The Rebellion of the Basement Lecturers, the Wandsworth prison disturbances of 1918 to 1919. Steve has done some work, we know, some research in the library, so we hope that that has contributed to what he's going to be able to talk about next week, and we do hope that you can join us then. As I said, the talk's been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly. And we'll be putting the link to that on the event webpage. So if you want to let people know that they can catch up with it later, please do that. And again, a reminder that our talks are free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so. And there's a donate button on our website. And we really do appreciate those of you who do that regularly. We acknowledge that, and we're very grateful. Thanks again. Goodbye until the same time next week. Take care, in solidarity. Very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.